Welcome to everyone. I just wanted to start by saying a little bit about the format of this, which is slightly unusual. We have, as you can see, 5 speakers, including me. We're all going to give little micro talks of 10 minutes on 5 different topics. 3 of them are basically historical. I'll be talking about the life of the author, Leonora Bernardi, who wrote the recently discovered pastoral play that we're celebrating in this workshop. Then Lisa Sampson will speak about the play itself. Emily Wilbourne will speak about the musical context of the play and the author's life. The author was a singer as well as a poet. And then we'll shift gear and start talking about the production later this week, the first ever the first modern production of this play, the first production since 1590. And the speakers there will be Eric Nicholson, who's the director of the play, and Cameron Anderson, who's its designer. And to save time, what I've done is print out people's biographies in the sheet that you should all have been given as you came in, so you can kind of follow those as we go along, and we won't have to bother with introductions. And I put them more or less in the order in which we're going to speak, except I swapped around Lisa Sampson and Emily Wilbourne by mistake. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Leonora Bernardi's life. It's not literally true that Bernardi was unknown before the discovery of the play we're talking about this evening, but I think it's fair to say that she was very little known indeed. When she first came onto my radar in the late 1990s as one of the earliest women writers to have written a secular play, a lost pastoral drama, lost at the time, the following facts were on record for her in accessible printed sources, mainly from the 18th and 19th centuries. We knew the place and the date of her birth, Lucca 1559. We knew the names of her parents, Lucrezia Trenta and Antonio Bernardi, both from wealthy and important families in Lucca. We knew the name of her husband, Vincenzo Belatti, and we knew where he came from, Castelnuovo di Garfagnana. Here is Castelnuovo di Garfagnana in this very mountainous area north of Lucca, and here is Lucca, so you can see they were pretty close by. We also know that Bernardi's husband was extremely wealthy and that she had one child, Pier Paolo. There's also an intriguing detail, which is that she was the goddaughter of Francesco I de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and that was a fact that had a certain weight in her life, a good connection to start life with. So where her artistic career was concerned, it's recorded that Leonora was a singer as well as a poet, as I said, and there's some intriguing 17th century gossip to the effect that she was responsible for driving away from the court of Ferrara a far better known singer and poet, Tarquinia Molza, because she, Leonora Bernardi, was so much younger and more attractive and more talented. That gossip doesn't cash out at all when you look at the dates, but it's kind of interesting nonetheless. Bernardi did spend some time at the court of Ferrara in 1585, and that's documented from other sources. At the other end of Bernardi's life, we have records of the fact that she retreated from the world to voluntary seclusion, religious seclusion in her house sometime before 1606, that she went blind around 1611, and that she died in her mid-50s in 1616. So that's her life, or what was known of her life at the time. Where her writings were concerned, I found a very few poems of hers in print, including the most famous one and most circulated, a canzone addressed to the Virgin Mary, which was published for the first time in 1591. I'm showing a manuscript copy of it here, and also the modern edition from an anthology I published in 2013. Although I only found a handful of poems by her in print, they were enough to get me very interested in Bernardi because they're highly accomplished pieces of work showing a real mastery of poetic form. So after the discovery of the Pastoral in 2010, I'll leave Lisa to talk more about that. Lisa and I, with another colleague, Anna Wainwright, embarked on an edition of the play, and in connection with that, we set about trying to see what more we could find out about Bernardi's life. The play itself had already given us a few more details. Most importantly, it confirmed her relationship with the Medici family in that the play seems to have been performed for Ferdinando de Medici and his Grand Duchess, Christine of Lorraine, in the early 1590s, around 1590, as I say. By the way, when I say first appearance in print, I mean the first time Bernardi appeared in print. The play itself never appeared in print. So yeah, we set about trying to see whether we could find anything more out about her life. And I have to say, I didn't have very high expectations when we set out. Bernardi seemed to be such a kind of faint and vaporous presence in the historical record. Despite intriguing signs that she was well connected and well known at the time during her lifetime. So I wasn't really sure that we would find anything of note. In fact, what we discovered about Bernardi's life over the past few years of research has greatly exceeded my expectations. And the great thing is, I'm pretty sure that there's a lot more also still out there to be found. Even on the basis of what we've found so far, Bernardi has gone from being someone barely visible in the historical record to being one of the best documented women of this whole era in Italy for one period of her life in particular. So what has emerged? One of our first discoveries was a dramatic indication of the fate of Leonora's husband, Vincenzo Belatti. On Christmas Eve of 1585, the year that the couple spent in Ferrara, Belatti was murdered in the courtyard of the ducal palace in the presence of the Duke. Examination of the correspondence between the Florentine ambassador in Ferrara and Grand Duke Francesco de' Medici back in Florence reveals that Leonora Bernardi herself and her family were the initial suspects for the killing, suggesting that the marriage was publicly known not to be entirely happy. And it's all getting a bit speculative at that point, but I think that finding may help shed light on a mysterious passage in Bernardi's Canzone to the Virgin, which I mentioned earlier. And I think this poem was probably written in 1588, which was the year of a great Marian miracle in Lucca. Bernardi speaks here in this first line about being in the 13th year of a time of great misery and suffering in her life. And that would lead us back to 1575, the probable date of her marriage to Belatti. So that was one important find. I'll skip some of our other finds and just report on our final, perhaps most spectacular discovery. It's what I was referring to when I described Leonora Bernardi as one of the best documented women of her era for a short period in her life. In the main library of Siena, we found a cache of letters exchanged between 1599 and 1605 between a Lucca-based letterato called Domenico Chiariti and an acquaintance of his in Siena, a better-known figure called Belisario Bulgarini. Chiariti wrote to Bulgarini virtually every week over the whole period, and Bulgarini replied very dense and substantial letters. I'm showing you a nice, quite legible example. They're not always that easy, with Chiariti's signature on display, if you can see it. Why this is of interest to us is that one of Chiariti's closest acquaintances in Lucca was precisely Leonora Bernardi, who he seems to have regarded with a kind of reverential admiration, not to say a complete crush. Here's his first mention of her from a letter of 1599. I'll read the translation. There is currently in the city a gentlewoman of Lucca, Leonora Bernardi Belatti, who is young, beautiful, and marvelously talented, or virtuous. Virtuosa can mean either. She is a sun in her beauty, a Minerva in her learning, and a Thalia in her grace. So for several years of her later life, then, as a result of Chiariti's fascination with her, we have an almost weekly detailed account of what the lovely Signora Leonora, as he calls her, is getting up to. It's completely extraordinary documentation. And it's useful not only for shedding light on Bernardi's biography, though it obviously does that. It's also very interesting more generally for the detailed information it gives us on what the cultural life of an educated woman might look like in a provincial city away from the great courts of Italy during an era that has in the past been seen as highly conservative and traditionalist where women's roles are concerned, the era of the Counter-Reformation, when the Catholic Church began to intervene with a new vigor in the moral lives of lay people. So in describing women's lives in this period, scholars have often taken their cue from prescriptive literature such as conduct manuals, and it's pretty clear if you look at those how a young or youngish widow was supposed to behave at this time. She was supposed to lock herself away from temptation, to lead a life of seclusion, to devote herself to prayer and memory and perhaps a few charitable works, and to conceive of herself as already dead, dead to the world and dead to the senses. Chiariti's letters regarding Leonora Bernardi showed that she did nothing of the kind. On the contrary, she seems to have set herself up as an important cultural figure in Lucca, hosting what Chiariti and Bulgarini both refer to as an academy in her house, where the latest works of literary and linguistic controversy were discussed, very often prior to their print publication. Chiariti's letters suggest that most of the participants in this salon were men, though we know of at least a few occasions when women were present, other women than Leonora. In an interesting counter-Reformation touch, the participants were both laymen and clerics. There's mention of churchmen gathering in her house on Sundays for religious conversation. But there are also indications of a more worldly aspect to these gatherings. One of Chiariti's most fascinating letters gives a detailed account of a banquet that Leonora hosted on the Feast of the Innocenti in 1602, the 28th of December, lasting long into the night and amazingly kind of staged with music and fabulous lighting and perfumed air from burners and specially crafted juniper toothpicks. You do get a lot of detail in these letters. And Chiariti reports all these details in a very kind of starstruck way. You get a very vivid sense here of a woman acquainted with the sophistication of court life, bringing it back and recreating it in a provincial domestic setting and leaving her neighbors almost literally dazzled. So there's no time to say any more now, but I hope I've said enough to convey quite how fascinating and unexpected Bernardi's life is, even independent of her qualities as a writer. She's a truly distinctive figure, and she's someone well deserving of being drawn out of her long historical oblivion to take a bow, as she is doing this week at La Pietra. That's it.
So, the single known manuscript copy of Bernardi's play in the Marciana library is titled simply Tragicommedia Pastorale. And in fact, the title that we're using for the performance has been inferred by similar sounding titles in 18th century references to Bernardi's then lost play. So in this little contribution, I want to consider Bernardi's dramaturgical choices, first with reference to genre, and in particular to the character Clorilli, who, as our title suggests, is key to the plotting, staging, and innovative pro-feminist perspective that we can see in the play. By around 1590, when Bernardi apparently composed her Clorilli for the baptism of the future Medici heir, Cosimo II, regular pastoral drama had been variously experimented with for some 4 decades, especially in her adopted city of Ferrara, stimulated by the rediscovery of Aristotle's Poetics. The pastoral's lack of clear classical precedents or theoretical codification meant that in practice it remained a relatively freer and more hybrid third genre compared with neoclassical comedy and tragedy. And this hybridity, which draws on an extensive performance tradition as well, is reflected in the various terms that were used for it at the time, things like favola pastorale, egloga, boschereccia, and other things. With the print publication of Torquato Tasso's masterpiece Aminta in 1580, the genre gained more respectability and profile, though, and it was widely imitated and performed. By 1598, Angelo Ingegneri famously noted that a good 1,000 such plays, ben mille pastorali, and maybe some exaggeration here, had been composed both in manuscript and in print. And these included 3 by women before Bernardi's work. So Barbara Torelli's Partennia, Maddalena Campiglia's Flori, and these were both noble women, so more like Bernardi's status, and Isabella Andrini's very popular Mirtilla, which had become very successful in print given the author's fame as a diva actress. For these first women, taking on the ambitious and morally fraught task of writing a 5-act drama for the stage, Pastoral provided a more decent alternative both to licentious comedy and to bloodthirsty, lugubrious tragedy. Importantly, the genre's main concern with love, expressed predominantly in lyric verse and in the fashionable Petrarchan mode, allowed, as the critic Angelo Ingegneri wrote, allowed virgins and honest women on stage in the form of nymphs, which would not be appropriate in comedy, giving rise to noble emotions, fitting even for tragedies. By the time Bernardi was writing, however, the status of this third genre had become more polemical as a result of the high-profile debate on Battista Guarini's masterpiece and pastoral tragicomedy, Pastor Fido. This debate started already in 1586 while the play was circulating unpublished in university and academy circles, which just reminds us that a play was certainly not immune from criticism while in manuscript, and this may explain Bernardi's own rather guarded approach to the presentation of her play, with her name and code, for example. The pastoral tragicomedy had been publicly attacked by Jason de Norris for being a monstrous mixture of the incompatible genres of comedy and tragedy, in his view, and for not observing the Aristotelian ideals of unity or verisimilitude or teaching morality. Guarini quickly defended his Pastor Fido, although pseudonymously, which he considered the first example of the new unified genre of pastoral tragicomedy. He argued that it artfully combined only tempered aspects of comedy and tragedy, and that his overall aim was hedonistic and comedic, solely, that is, to purge melancholy and to delight its audiences through imitation. It's probably safe to assume, bearing in mind what we've just heard about Bernardi, that she would have been well aware of such critical questions as she began her own composition, especially given her own close connections with Ferrarese circles where Guarini operated. And of course, his second defense was also published in Florence. And in Florence, Medici circles had also recently developed a practical interest in pastoral performances, both in public and privately, by aristocratic women. So, for example, in 1590, the Medici princesses performed two now-lost pastorals by Laura Guidiccioni Lucchesini, set to music by Emilio de' Cavalieri and Tasso's Aminta. Guarini and Tasso's presence in Florence separately between 1588 and 1590, and an unrealized attempt to perform the Pastor Fido at court, also suggests there was a really intense interest in pastoral around this time in Florence, to which Bernardi's play must have responded, probably drawing also on her experiences in Ferrara. But how far does she imitate or diverge from earlier models, or observe Guarini's principles set out for pastoral tragicomedy? So I'm going to look a little bit, to answer this, at the plot structure. So Bernardi's tragicommedia uses a double structure like that of Guarini. A serious comedy plot follows the travails of a young couple, Clorilli and Filemone, especially developed in the first three acts, and a second plot involving Dalinda and Filinio is largely tragic in the second two acts. And these plots are structurally linked at the exact center point of the play, the 15th of 30 scenes, where Filinio, the lover of Dalinda, saves Clorilli from a satyr attack, as you can get some idea from contemporary illustrations of how this might have been imagined anyway. And she recognizes him as her brother. Both plots have the obligatory happy ending of Pastoral with reference to an offstage double wedding. As Virginia Cox has noted elsewhere, Bernardi's plot, rather innovatively, largely divides up the plot of Tasso's Aminta between the two couples, observing the same balanced and tempered tragicomic structure. But Bernardi's play differs substantially from Aminta in terms of its dramaturgy. It is a much more dynamic, comic staged element, like the pastorals of Guarini and Agostino Beccari before her. Thematically, too, it avoids dramatizing in either plot the conventional dilemma for nymphs of whether to follow chastity or love, because both the nymphs have in fact already been in love. So, instead, a rather more polemical focus is added to question the abuses of forced marriage and the importance of free choice for the individual, which affects all the lovers, as well as the need for mutual respect and fidelity, or fede, between the sexes. And these themes are, of course, brought to the fore in the play by the Guarinian backstory, or antefatto, of the attempt by Dalinda's father 2 years earlier to pressure this very young girl, only 17 at the time, into making a loveless, infelice marriage to Filemone, Clorilli's lover. And this ultimately fails when Dalinda arranges to elope in romance style with her secret lover before the wedding, although plans, as we'll see in the performance, go rather awry. In fact, during the play's action, the tragedic lovers never meet on stage, and Dalinda is characterized especially by a tragic pathos. By contrast, the other nymph, Clorilli, is the focus for most of the staged action. At the start of the play, she has rejected her former lover, Filemone, for very weakly agreeing to marry Dalinda to satisfy his father, despite having sworn his faith to her. He still continues desperately to protest his love. So the intermediaries, Armilla and Colibante, try to fix a meeting between the former lovers, to, on the one hand, to soften Clorilli's anger or sdegno, and to make Filemone man up. A sequence of staged events build up a crescendo before the lovers' meeting in Act 3. So you have a satyr attack, you have a fight scene, Filinio's joyful embrace on recognizing his sister, which forms a kind of spectacle in a spectacle, which is misconstrued by Filemone, who is jealously watching. He consequently flees after their meeting, and we hear he attempts suicide, which moves Clorilli to attempt suicide herself on stage. So, Bernardi's play gives the two female protagonists strikingly determining roles in terms of the genre between the comic and the tragic, which may explain why they never meet on stage. Clorilli in particular is given distinct visibility. She appears in 1/3 of the scenes, 10, the second most of any character, and she's the only lover to appear across the two parts of the play. And this allows her to show virtuoso versatility in bridging comic, pastoral, and tragic performance modes, a skill much prized in professional actresses at the time. Even so, she maintains feminine propriety, which would make the play rather more suited to aristocratic performance. So there's not much sensuality and there's no cross-dressing. Instead, Clorilli demonstrates mastery in verbal wit and irony through her sparring, her contrasti, her experience of regaining, as she puts it, her original liberty after being rejected in love, has armed her with a ready tongue, conceits, and a knowledge of the perfidy of men. Reminds me a bit of Veronica Franco in this respect. So Clorilli is the character most associated with many of the ideological polemics in the play too, especially against males, fathers and lovers, who betray women's trust through force or fraud to satisfy their desires. Interestingly, it's Clorilli's own father who explicitly states that forced marriages transgress the laws of nature and of God. And this one thing, nature and God have conceded them their liberty. And the polemic against fraudulent male lovers reaches its climax in a long, virtuosic speech by Clorilli's companion nymph Lycasta, which seems to take issue specifically with Tasso's famous hedonistic Golden Age ideal, that if it pleases, if it is allowed, it is pleasing, by equating this with male desire and male insincerity. So to conclude, Bernardi presents her polemic ambiguously, more like an antithesis in the play. After all, both the male lovers in her play prove faithful in the end. The reprehensible satyr and Dalinda's father are duly chastised. At the same time, the character Clorilli doesn't get away scot-free either. She is blamed on stage for her ambiguous words, her excessive anger, and bestial cruelty, which has transgressed gender decorum by feminizing Filemone, her lover. Bernardi's Pastoral therefore offers no clear moral message, nor a sense of a higher divine order guiding the events, which is unusual in Pastoral. And the happy reunion of the lovers pointedly takes place in an imagined space off stage. Bernardi thus seems remarkably reluctant to offer authority or indeed her own authorial identity, even compared with other female pastoralists. Her play overtly fulfills Guarini's hedonistic aim of pastoral tragicomedy, therefore, in delighting, and it avoids the slur of affectation of teaching moral lessons, which might have been undesirable if the play was for a known courtly audience. So to conclude, Bernardi's enigmatic tragicomedia pastorale playfully uses the new genre to suggest a forceful, underlying pro-feminist polemic, and overtly it showcases female rhetorical mastery and agency, especially under the pastoral mask of Clorilli. Thank you.
I'm going to unplug this headphone jack and stick it in my phone, which is noise. It's amazing. Usually it makes a rather obnoxious noise. So I want to talk to you today about music at the turn from the end of the 16th century and the start of the 17th century. Now, I'm short too. Musically, this is a really big change. It's the end of what we call in music history the Renaissance and the start of what we call the Baroque. And there are two elements that contributed more than others to this change. And one was the kind of singing that happened in the court of Ferrara, and the other was theatrical music. So in this figure of Bernardi and in the repertoire that she was engaged with, we see both of these aspects. So the first thing that I'm going to do for you is to play two musical examples. One, they're both texts that are a kind of sad, lamenting texts. They're both set by the same composer, Claudio Monteverdi. I wanted to give it a sort of little bit of continuity. But what I want you to listen for is the two very different ways in which the text has been treated in the music that has been composed to perform this music. So the first example that I'm going to play for you is what we call a madrigal. Now, a madrigal is a polyphonic piece of music, so multiple voices are singing at the same time with different melodic shapes. And the ideal of madrigal performance was that a group of relatively well-educated people who were coming together for something precisely like the kind of evenings, entertainment, and discussion of literary text that we know Bernardi engaged in, and they would together sing madrigals as a means of entertainment. So the music itself is not necessarily particularly difficult in each of its individual parts, but when you put the individual parts together, you get this texture of music where you can hear the different voices illustrating the music in different kinds of ways. To stop it because the musical texture keeps going, right? These parts are coming in, they're overlapping. If I asked you to sing the melody back to me, it's very difficult to do because there's not a single melody. There are these layers of melody that are all happening at the same time. Now, the second piece of music that I want to play for you, which was composed very closely alongside that piece that we just listened to by the same composer, is instead a piece of theatrical music. And it's a piece of what we call monody, and it is Arianna's Lament from a now lost opera, one of the first operas from 1608. But what you will hear is a single solo voice enacting a part. The accompaniment is provided by a semi-improvised ensemble who are following the rhythmic patterns of the singer, who has a lot of freedom because they don't have to keep in time with 4 other people who are singing at the same time. They're just singing their part, and you can hear in the voice of this person, the music is literally enacting the emotional experiences that the person is having. So this is Arianna's Lament. You can hear the difference, right? So these two types of music are right on this cusp of time, between the end of the 1500s, the start of the 1600s. And one of the first things that started to change was at the court of Ferrara, where the Duke, Alfonso d'Este, particularly liked to gather in the evenings and hear the ladies of his court sing madrigals. Some of these ladies were better singers than others. And he started to request over and over again that the other women not sing. And then he took it a step further. He invited particular women who were known as singers to join the court as ladies-in-waiting and have, as part of their responsibility, this obligation to sing every night. Then he had his composer, Luzzasco Lazzaschi, compose music specifically for these three singers that took into account the particular ways their voices worked together and created music that became harder and harder, required more and more rehearsal. And he was known at these performances that he started to call his musica secreta, his secret little private music to which only invited guests would come. There are stories of him showing them the score, guests the score, and saying, look, they sing it exactly as it's written in the score. So here's Duke d'Alfonso d'Este basically using these women singers as part of his wife's court as a kind of recording device that can play back exactly this music that's really difficult, that's happening for him and for him alone, this very private kind of space. But the role of these women in the court, something that had been, we gather together and a few of us will happen to sing, singing for each other, starts to become this activity where some people are listeners and some people are performers, and you get a literal kind of performance happening rather than a kind of convivial music making together. So this element of representation and of performance and of being on display starts to get incorporated into this still music making that's still very communal, although moving away towards this kind of new soloistic repertoire. At the same time, we have this invention of this new kind of monody, which has been argued back and forth exactly when it happens, but it does seem to have some kind of relationship to the genre of pastoral. Some scholars have argued that the two missing pastorals that Lisa mentioned, written by Laura Giudiconi and with the music by Emilio Cavalieri, were among the first operas, but we don't have them, so nobody knows for sure if they were operas or not. But this new music that you heard in that second example, the whole premise behind it is the music is participating in the narration of the events, that the singer is enacting the events. They're interrupting themselves, they're breaking down, they're speeding up when they're excited, they're slowing down, with a sort of freedom of rhythmic declamation that is just not possible in the madrigal because all these other people are singing at the same time. And it isn't entirely clear to scholars how much music was in these early pastorals, but we do know that there was a lot of music in them. There was music in them as a structural function, what is called the intermedi, which were musical elements that happened between the acts. So there wasn't a theater with a curtain. There certainly weren't electric lights that could be turned on and off. In the intermission between the acts, even in a public theater, which a lot of these pastorals were not performed in the public theater, they were performed more in a room among friends with a semi-private kind of performance. Between the acts, the lights are not coming on. The lights are on all the time. The candles are on, the scene is set up. And the differentiation between the scenes was articulated by the performance of some kind of music, more or less elaborate, depending on the cause. Then there are all the moments in the play where you can have what is called diegetic music. So somebody singing a song. They're singing a song to their lover because they want to change their mind. They're singing a song because they're celebrating. They're singing a song because it's a wedding. They're singing a song because it's someone's birthday. Then there are other moments where once the transition into opera happens, they say these are the moments you can have aria because these are the moments when it's verosimile that you'll have song. They're the moments when gods appear, laments, prayers, invocations. All of these moments happen, not necessarily the gods, but everything else happens with incredible frequency in pastoral drama, and several of the first operas were pastoral stories. And the last thing that I want you to really think about is the fact that performance and recitation in the 16th and 17th century was not done in the same kind of voice that was used when you talk to your friends, even the same kind of voice that was used when you talk at an elevated literary gathering where you're trying to impress people by the amount of poetry that you can drop into your conversation, but that used a heightened declamation. There are several scholars, Eleanor Abraham von Rieck, who's argued that poetry itself was always sung. There are certainly many singers, and many female singers in particular, who were famed at the time for their ability to improvise song on a piece of given poetry. They could accompany themselves with a set of, basic kind of set of chord changes where they knew that the poetic meter was a certain length. They could fit any given song to it, but they could improvise it and add ornaments and alter it in ways that was very effective. We also know that some of these moments, one of the things you'll notice, I think it's still, did you keep the big lament in the performance? I don't know how they're actually going to perform it at the performance on Friday. But one of the particular, for example, the lament, which comes out of Pastoral, comes out of a long tradition and is a central element of early opera, has a number of musical features that are also poetic features. So that's spoken in the first person. The singer interrupts himself to say, I may, alas, asks questions all the time. Why? What have I done? What did I do? Why am I still living when my love is dead? All of these questions, which are just very typical of the genre, which create a kind of musical structure. And then a repeating refrain that happens at irregular intervals. Now, if you imagine a kind of performance where someone is declaiming in a dramatic voice this text that then repeats the refrain in this particular lament in the Clorilli text is, you fountain reveal my fierce pain's bitter history to all. It punctuates the text. So there's this why, alas, why, you, O fountain, da 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 da. Why, da da da, you, O fountain. So you get this repeating energy. And if this is being declaimed in a voice by singers and by poets who are renowned for their ability to improvise song, there's no reason to think that those weren't always sung, even though this is an opera, even though this is something that's happening at the same time. And to think of these overlapping circles, we know these are genres that had lots of music, but we also need to think about how close the performance might have been to music, even if it isn't necessarily falling into that neat box of like, oh, here's the score, and here's the rhythms, and here's how they would have done it. Because the concept of improvisation and the very texture of poetry and of theater were fluid. That's it.
Just short and sweet. We have, the burden of time upon us. And first, I just want to thank all of you for being here, wonderful students, and thank you, Lucca. Yes, so I don't break my back, although I am playing, as you see, a certain kind of character, and hence the beard. Please, Friday night, be there. We have a fantastic group of performers and a crew and support team, and it's just a extraordinary opportunity to be doing this here at NYU, so I want to acknowledge that first of all. Following up on these more formal presentations, I've been asked to talk about the adaptation for the stage. How do you make that move from the page to the stage with a playwright, her work, who was not a professional, and she is more of a poet, really, than a practicing actress, and someone who worked full-time with companies who had become fully professional by this point, and the most famous being led by a woman, Isabella Andrini, who you heard about as a major pastoral author. So the challenge is to really bring this to theatrical life, and I'll let you know that if we were doing the entire show, you'd be there till almost midnight. The script really could, with the songs, the intermezzi, last about 4 or 5 hours in performance. But don't worry about that. It ought to be about an hour and a half or 2 hours. But to show you that in this project, which is this version of practice as research, really, where our practice is a form of exploring from a research point of view as well, how these texts really work into the modern world and what they can speak to us and how we can understand them from their own approach and their own bias, being that Pastoral was all about the confrontation between the old and the new, the ancient and the modern, in this third genre that Lisa Sampson was talking about. And therefore, when a director, and I've done a few pastorals before, Winter's Tale, for example, by Shakespeare, which had been done by Adrian Noble of the Royal Shakespeare Company in a 1930s style, to make it more accessible to a modern audience. When I did that, of course, an obvious choice was the 60s and 70s, and bringing in music such as by the Beach Boys, by the Beatles, by Jimi Hendrix, to make this confrontation with the ancient connect with the modern. And when I first came across this text, I was thinking about that. How can we bring this to the modern world? Will we make it more contemporary, the way that the plays then, and of course the model for this is Aminta, were both about the ancient world, this golden age, this utopian period that Torquato Tasso was evoking, but also famously in that work at Ferrara, it's a Romana clay. It's about the contemporary world in Ferrara, and contemporary issues can be confronted through the veil of the old. So approaching this in our new version, this premiere, a 400-year-old play, and talking with Cameron Anderson, we were experimenting. Should we make this, and purposeful anachronism? How much can we have modern costumes mixed with ancient ones, for example? And these are the kinds of choices to confront. In the end, what you'll see is probably a more moderate approach with more understatements about this. So there aren't these glaring, kind of clashes between the old and the new, while respecting some of the more, even topical references to Ferdinando de Medici. To tip you off already, you'll hear about this character named Dinando, who was a code name for Ferdinando, and Cristilla, who was Bernardi's code name for Christine de Lorraine, who were the patrons at the probably original performance. There's one theory it might have been done for the christening of their child. And that sort of compliment we decided we would keep there and challenge you a bit to take you back into that period, a little bit of a history lesson. And so we're going to be praising the rulers then. But that sort of praising can happen now, of course, in flattering a person in power today. So we're condensing that. You'll see that, that is the distillation to try to make a specific historical reference, a topical reference, using some of the original kind of music. We'll have Monteverdi in our soundtrack, at least, for example, with a slightly more modern reference toward the end. And we're aiming at that kind of balance, as you'll see and hear on Friday. To take one more example, there's a long, elaborate compliment to someone who may have been in the first audience. She was probably a friend of Bernardi. Her name was Marfisa d'Este, who was a dynamic, brilliant cultural patron at the court of Ferrara. And she is known as Celia in our work. We're going to present that to you, but we're going to do it in a way that hopefully will provide a bridge and make that person more accessible to you, and relate it to how a superstar kind of woman could be evoked and admired today through the energy of the actors, partially who have been researching this, through the practice. And that's been finally, as I conclude this very brief presentation, it's the practice that counts. The proof is in the pudding. We've had to experiment, with alternative locutions, help of Virginia Cox yesterday, discarding what could have been an interesting poetic word because it fits the character, who, Philemone I'm talking about, who is, like many of these other lovelorn shepherds of the pastoral genre, he's a kind of poetry nerd, you might say. He lives, breathes 24/7 poetry, and recycles Petrarchan tropes as his daily fare. So a certain recherche word, which might be more Shakespearean, we were keeping, but we decided, and through the help of Virginia, maybe it was too recherche. So we're going to modernize that. I won't tell you what that is yet. It'll be a reward for you to catch it. But that's the sort of example that you can only do through rehearsal, through the practice, and fine-tuning what could have been something very much of an ancient artifact, let's say a curious piece, a topical one, really, if you do it in that certain way, to bridge it into the modern world while respecting its own nods toward the ancient world, which we'll have, but done in a way that might make it a little more timeless, by projecting the future. If you're paying close attention to our costumes, now I'll turn it over to my distinguished colleague, and I'm delighted to have as a collaborator, Cameron Anderson. A few references to Star Wars and Wonder Woman also will appear in our own kind of trans-historical adaptation, some other eco-friendly touches, because after all, pastoral is a genre which confronts nature in its relationship to civilization, and we are in a perfect site-specific setting here. By the way, you ought to know that the Mugnone River, which takes a major part in the script of the play, in its plot, its drama, it flows a few yards below our performance site. So it's very exciting to be in this space which evokes nature, which respects nature in the end, and explores that presence of nature in still our contemporary world and the crisis we're facing with climate change and what's driving us crazy a little bit through rehearsals is really integral to the genre, and we'll probably respect that just by doing it. And you can be participating in this marvelous space, which is the La Pietra Gardens. So really look forward to seeing all of you on Friday, and grazie mille. Okay, please, Cam.
So I also want to thank everyone here, all the actors, the administration, Virginia Cox for having me back to participate in this very unique opportunity. Usually the job of the set designer is to look at an empty stage and bring something to life from nothing, right? So you're usually confronted with a blank page as a designer in traditional opera or designing for traditional theater. And what's so unique about this opportunity is that instead of being confronted by a blank page, I'm confronted with one of the most beautiful visions one could ever imagine before all of us. And so it's been a unique experience for me also thinking about how this genre relates to site-specific theater. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term site-specific theater. It's becoming very popular to move productions outside of theaters and into found spaces, into warehouses, into spaces that bring specific meanings. So you'll often create a piece of theater in a space, particularly because that space carries a meaning. So you might do a production in a prison or in a graveyard or somewhere where the very ground that you're standing on brings meaning to the piece, which is interesting in relationship to what Eric just said, that we are in the very space that many of these scenes were carried out and many of the characters lived, which is so, to me, inspiring. And so the process that Eric and I went through, I'm just going to talk briefly about that and briefly about our concept, was thinking about how to visually support the story that we're telling, how to use the spaces of the garden in an inspiring way, in a practical way, in an evocative way. Many times when you're designing, when you're, as a designer working, a lot of your job is also about moving the audience and thinking about what architecture of the space makes sense for this scene. We're not going to erect large pieces of scenery in front of the villa, pretending to be a villa, right? We're not going to put a stage out into the middle of the space, but why not use the side right here of the Villa La Pietra, where there is a natural stage. So trying to find spaces that can hold these scenes in sort of a natural way, and then creating visual sort of splashes or support for particular moments in the piece. So that was sort of our theory when we started out, was thinking about how can the audience move in a natural flow through the scenes. What kind of surprises do we want to have? How can we create spaces with entrances and exits so that actors can arrive and disappear? And how can we do it all in a way that really evokes the storytelling that we want to in the piece? And some of the themes that we were drawn to were this idea of the purification through water. Eric brought sort of to the table this interest in the element of water. There's so many references to water in the piece. Of course, Philomene threw this sort of suicide attempt falls into water, and sort of through this rebirth of Clorilli's tears, they're reunified. Of course, the Lacosta's monologue, where she relates men to the inconstancy of water, and this beautiful this proto-feminist monologue. So there's so many images of water, so we became interested in how we could manifest those visually. That was one theme that we're interested in. Another one is that we decided early on to have Bernardi be a character in our piece. So she is, I won't give away, but she is in the play. We've put her into the piece. And I got very interested in how we could use these beautiful manuscripts that you saw as parts of the props. So you will see, if you keep your eyes out, you'll see things around that are made from the manuscripts. In particular, there is a puppet, a dove puppet. There's a monologue in the first scene that's a metaphor describing a dove. And so we've created this beautiful shadow puppet that's made from the manuscripts themselves. The feathers are made, and you see the words written on the feathers. So we've found ways to integrate her actual writing, which I see as a celebration of this woman's voice that's being brought back to life after hundreds of years. So those are two kind of visual themes that we were interested in. Also, I was fascinated by this combination of the modern and the classical that the genre contained in its time, and also how we could transport that to now. And another way that we're doing that is by using video projections. So the main sort of visual experience that you'll have will be when for the second second two-thirds of the piece, we move down to near the teatrino, and I don't want to give everything away, but we're having very large-scale projections in 5 or 6 different parts of the piece that are sort of artistic illustrations of the monologues that are being given. And we chose moments that were very that the language already contained very rich visual metaphor. And the language we've used visually is a combination of art historical images that have been animated. So there's sort of a combination of things that you'll see and you'll think, oh, that's a Caravaggio, and then you'll watch it do something very modern and unexpected. So we hope that in the video itself, we've captured this combination of the modern and the classical, and just the fact that we're projecting onto the garden itself is another illustration of that idea. And something really that I think is quite beautiful is that the projection, you've probably seen theater where you see a big screen and projections are flat and it looks like you're watching a movie, but you're in a theater or an opera. Our projections are very natural looking because they're all broken up on the leaves, so someone's face is already sort of broken up and sort of it becomes pointillistic, the image that is on the hedge. So I'm really excited to see the manifestation of that. We will have Thursday to look at the video and make any changes, and then have the performance Friday. So this is all happening right in this moment. We are discovering these things for the first time, and problem solving. I mean, working outside just practically is so challenging in theater. If it rains, we have a backup plan. If we go here, we go there. The projector's going to get wet. There's so many things that can happen that we then sort of instantaneously have to shift gears and change. But it's just been such a delight to get to work with such illustrious scholars on this topic and learn from them, and then get to go out and make something based on the text. It's very unusual as an artist to get to collaborate with scholars. So it's been such a delight, and just especially to be connected to this woman and to feel this connection across hundreds of years, to be able to do the first modern performance of her piece. I think that's all I have. Yeah.
To echo what Cameron just said, it is a dream come true. Amazing scholars. It wasn't said, but it was Lisa Sampson herself who rediscovered the manuscript. Bernardi was waiting for this moment, and you'll hear there is this dream monologue. So you're part of this experiment, as Cameron Anderson just explained, the first time ever. And the current forecast is for decent weather, but bring your umbrellas. Try to get there early enough to sit a little farther away from this great hedge screen that Cameron just mentioned, so you get an optimal view. And yeah, help us make the dream come true. Really appreciate all of your participation, and thanks again to the people who are hosting this. Grazie. Okay, so. Actors, yeah, and we need to move over because we have a run-through right now, and our guest professional artist is coming, but people, please stay for discussion as well. I hope we can.